Hello law students. This video is the second part of an introduction to legislative history research. In the last video, we explored the different documents that comprise a federal statute's legislative history information. In this video, you will learn where you can find these various documents. This video will cover two different research approaches, using paid databases or using free resources. No matter what resources you use, your first step will be to gather basic citation information regarding the statute you're researching. Remember that permanent public laws have two forms: the session law version and the U.S. Code version. The session law version is the original text of the statute as passed by Congress, while the U.S. Code reorganizes and rearranges the provisions of a session law. We are ultimately more interested in the session law citation than the U.S. Code citation. After all, the legislative history information will be tied directly to the session law. Meanwhile, a U.S. Code section will be related to many different session laws that each have their own different legislative histories. So, we need to keep in mind that different passages of a U.S. Code section were likely created by different session laws, but we are only interested in finding the session law that enacted the language relevant to our research. Every session law has two citation forms, one for the statutes at large, the bound compilation of session laws, and the public law number. If you're starting from a U.S. Code section, you can find citations to every session law that enacted or amended that section in the credits at the bottom of the section. Note that most of these session law citations also include the specific section of that session law that relates to the code section. You will next want to figure out which one of those public laws enacted the language you are researching. As we will see later, this is a bit easier if you are using a paid database, but the official version of the U.S. Code can help too. In the official version, after the credits section, you will typically see a heading that says Editorial Notes, and under that heading will be a list of amendments. Look through that list of amendments for a paragraph that starts with the subsection in question. For example, we can see here that subsection A1 was added by Public Law 1098. Specifically, it's section 212. As we proceed through the process, you will see how to find further related citations, including the bill number. As is generally the case in legal research, your strategies for legislative history research will depend on what paid resources you have access to. Subscription databases can make legislative history research significantly simpler and easier as they pre-compile the documents for you. So, we will look at the research process using three databases: Westlaw, HeinOnline, and ProQuest Congressional. Each provide you with compilations of legislative history documents, though with different routes to arrive there. We'll start with Westlaw, which you are likely the most familiar with as a law student. First, let's pull up a U.S. Code section, 11 U.S.C. section 507. Let's assume we are interested in the history behind subsection A1. Next, we want to find which public law enacted the language we're interested in. The simplest way to do that in Westlaw is to scroll down to the credits and take a look at the various public laws amending this section. You can open those various public laws in different tabs and use your browser's search function to search for the relevant language. Using that approach, I learned that the relevant language was enacted with Public Law 1098, and within that public law, the section appeared at section 212. Next, you can click on the Legislative History Materials tab at the top of the document. That tab will list every legislative history document Westlaw has that is associated with that public law. In this case, most of the documents are various entries in the congressional record. But as discussed in the previous video, the best evidence of legislative intent comes from the committee report that was published when the bill was recommended by the committee and sent to the chamber floor. We can quickly narrow down to see just the reports by clicking Reports under the Content Types filter. This bill apparently had 2 committee reports, though after quickly reviewing them, it's clear that one of them has the information we're looking for. Specifically, we are interested to see if there is a section-by-section analysis discussing the legislative intent behind Section 212. The quickest way to check is to use the browser to search for 212. Now, one circumstance you might encounter is if the specific provision at issue was not part of the bill at the time it passed out of committee. In that case, you won't find a committee report statement on the legislative intent for that provision. You may need to rely on other sources of legislative history, like legislator floor statements or hearings, though these are not given as much evidentiary weight as committee reports. HeinOnline also contains precompiled history for certain statutes. A precompiled legislative history is a publication that contains all or most of the documents associated with a public law's passage. While Hein does not have histories for every statute, its collection is fairly extensive and the available histories are detailed. You can first find HeinOnline's legislative history library in our library's database list, under the U.S. Congressional Resources tab. Alternatively, from Hein's front page, you can find U.S. Federal Legislative History Library and click it followed by Title Collection. You can browse the available statutes a few different ways, though the most reliable will be to browse by public law number. Select the appropriate Congress, which is also the first part of the public law citation, and then the statute number. Here, we see that Hein has a legislative history for 1098. This legislative history is split between several volumes, though we can see a listing of all the included documents through the cumulative contents. There, it turns out that the committee reports are brought to the front of the history. Within this browser-based PDF, we could navigate by page number according to the table of contents, looking for the section-by-section analysis which discusses Section 212, or we can click the magnifying glass icon above the PDF and search this section, which limits the search to the report. If we search for 212, the top result will be the legislative intent discussion. Perhaps the most comprehensive source of legislative history materials is ProQuest Congressional. This database contains every document published by Congress, and it indexes each of those documents to the statutes and legislation that they pertain to. You can find ProQuest Congressional in the library's database list, under U.S. Congressional Resources. This database is not limited to legislative history materials, so you won't necessarily be able to tell just from the interface how to get these documents. The simplest approach is to click Search for a Citation, and then enter a unique identifying citation, such as the public law or statutes at large number. This will pull up every indexed document related to that law, organized by content type. In this case, ProQuest appears to have the fewest documents associated with the law, though this is mostly because congressional record entries have not been included. You might also notice a link when searching by public law number, which goes to Legislative Insight. Legislative Insight is a very similar database, also from ProQuest, which focuses just on legislative history materials. You will mostly get the same results, though I have found you may get documents relating to earlier related bills in results for a given statute. Outside of law school, you likely won't have access to all of those tools, or possibly any of them. To that end, you should know how to look up these documents manually using freely available sources. This will naturally involve more work, but it's worth understanding. Note that there may be more limitations on availability online, but we have many of these resources in print in the library as well. First, let's see how you can access statutes in both their codified and session law forms via GovInfo and the Library of Congress websites. There are many ways to access the U.S. Code, though there are fewer free ways to access historical versions. For editions going back to 1994, you can use GovInfo.gov. From the front page, scroll down to the bottom of the Popular list of titles. Then, click United States Code. GovInfo's historical versions of the code update the entire code for each year, which is a bit different from how the official print version of the code gets published. We'll get into that in just one moment. Note that GovInfo only has the code going back to 1994. For older editions, that is, from 1934 through 1988, you can instead use the Library of Congress's online version of the code, which is available at this URL. The main thing you will notice is that it only has editions every 6 years, which is how the code is published in print. For years in between those editions, you will need to refer to the annual supplements, which include any amendments to sections that were passed since the last full edition. Now, the Library of Congress's version is a bit less user-friendly, but it is still comprehensive. You can also find session laws on both GovInfo and the Library of Congress. To find session laws in GovInfo, first go to Category, and then under the default heading Bills and Statutes, you can see Public and Private Laws, which allows you to browse by the public law form, and Statutes at Large, which allows you to browse by the bound volumes. GovInfo has session laws in the public law form going back to 1995, while it has the Statutes at Large volumes going back to 1951. The Library of Congress, on the other hand, has the Statutes at Large dating all the way back to the first Congress. It is available at this URL. If you scroll to the end of a session law, you will find a limited list of citations to documents in the statute's legislative history, such as the bill number, certain reports, or action dates in the congressional record. This legislative history is generally not comprehensive, but it is a good starting point, and those documents could be the most important ones. A list of dates of various actions on bills can be useful for a couple of purposes. They provide a chronology of the bill's history, and they can give you dates to look up in the congressional record to find vote counts and floor statements. The most user-friendly and content-rich source of legislative action information is Congress.gov. This site contains a wealth of information about progress on bills. One possible use for it is to search by session law citation information. Under the main search bar, select More Options, and then find the search field for Legislation and Law Numbers. It gives examples of how it expects you to enter a public law or statutes at large citation. First, select the enacting Congress under the list of Congresses. Then, enter the citation accordingly. Hit search, and you'll find a full suite of information about the bill for that law. Go to the Actions tab, and in the filter bar to the left, select All Actions. That will pull up a full history of actions that occurred in the process of passing that law. Meanwhile, the Overview section will most likely also show the most relevant committee report on the bill, and possibly provide a link to the full text of that report. You can also check bill histories contained in the congressional record, which is freely available on GovInfo. This is a bit less user-friendly, but it will contain references to the exact page numbers that are relevant to a bill, which can make it a more direct tool. A list of each action taken on a bill, along with citations to reports issued about that bill, will be included in the History of Bills and Resolutions table. That table is contained toward the end of the Congressional Record volume for a given year. On GovInfo.gov, you can access a year's bill history a couple of different ways. For Congresses from 1983 and on, you can browse the bill histories directly in the browser. From the front page, go to Category, then Proceedings of Congress, and then History of Bills. From there, you can select the Congress, bill type, and then browse by number. For earlier Congresses, you will need to browse the digitized copy of the Congressional Record. From the Proceedings of Congress page, select Congressional Record Bound Edition, and then browse to the volume for the appropriate year. Select that year, and then browse through the lists of parts towards the end. Generally, the second to last or last part of that year will have the history of bills and resolutions. That will lead you to a large PDF listing each bill for that session of Congress, organized by bill type. Skip through the document until you find the type for your bill, and then look for the bill number. Congress.gov can also be used to compare the text of a statute against prior drafts of the bill. After searching for a law and pulling up the bill, select the Text tab. If there is a number greater than 1 in that tab, that means there are multiple drafts that were voted on. You can identify the drafts by the action date, and then you can read their full text. The simplest source of committee hearings is GovInfo.gov. However, its coverage is not complete. It has most hearings that were conducted starting with the 104th Congress. Earlier hearings, however, are likely to be unavailable. You can find these hearings from the front page of GovInfo by clicking Congressional Hearings under the Popular heading, then Browse by Congress, Chamber, and then Committee. Hearings not available from GovInfo won't be universally collected in one free source, but many might be found on various web sources or in other libraries. This might be a time to cautiously search Google for the hearing's name, and if you find results, confirm that the source is reliable. If you cannot find a source for a hearing that you are aware of, that is a good time to consult a reference librarian. As described in the past video, arguably the most important form of legislative history evidence is the committee reports available on a bill. Aside from paid databases, these are largely available through GovInfo. The simplest way to find them on GovInfo is simply to navigate to Congressional Reports under the Popular heading on the front page, and then navigate by Congress, Chamber, and then report number, much like with the hearings. However, also like hearings, coverage becomes less reliable before the 104th Congress. Many earlier reports are still available through this page, but that will not be guaranteed. If the report is not available in that collection on GovInfo, it will be harder to reliably find it on another free internet source. Now you should know that all congressional reports, as well as certain other things published by Congress, are permanently bound in a long-running print series called the Congressional Serial Set. If you have access to HeinOnline, you can browse the entire run of the serial set. From the front page, you can look for the U.S. Congressional Serial Set. You can find the specific report you're looking for by selecting the relevant range of years, and then entering the report's citation in the Citation Lookup tool. Now, if you don't have access to a paid database that includes congressional reports, and that report is not available on GovInfo, your options will be more difficult. The law library has many, though not all, volumes of the serial set, and other libraries may have their own runs of that title. But it may be tricky for you to track that down on your own. I would recommend that you ask a law librarian for assistance if you're in this situation. There are other nuances to legislative history research that were outside the scope of these videos. We also did not cover state legislative history research, which generally must be done in print. But hopefully this has demystified the process and will help you get started. Please reach out to a librarian if you get stuck in the process, and we should be able to set you back on the right path.